This is an exciting time in Scotland's story, and understanding our past will help us determine our future. And when Scotland's voice is heard, it charts the way forward. This is Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.
Welcome to Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond, where we're back this week in our Glasgow studios after some very interesting on-location shooting. Now today is the 5th of October, and what that means is it is my birthday. But as well as being my birthday today, also polls are about to close in the Rutherglen and Hamilton West by-election. So today we look at the issue that had dominated Scottish politics since that last and famous by-election in Hamilton almost half a century ago, Scottish independence. However, this is the first election where independence has not been acknowledged as the key issue at the centre of the campaign. Instead, the three candidates from the leading parties have stated that the cost of living crisis is the most important issue in the campaign for Rutherglen and Hamilton West. And so, to redress that balance, today we speak about progress towards independence, or perhaps lack of it, by speaking to a leading academic, a rebel nationalist MP, an SNP MP, and a Scottish Government former civil servant, now turned political activist. So along with that galaxy of political talent, and you are in with a treat, we return to our regular features. Scotland's Sydney Heroes with a new series coming from Alex after the competition winners of last week. And of course your tweets, messages and emails. And of course Alex's summation on today's topic. But first, over to Alex, who's in conversation with Robin McAlpine of Commonweal.
With the independence strategic vision in a state of some confusion, help may be at hand from leading thinker Robin McAlpine, who in the last few days has published a new strategy for independence. Robin, welcome to Scotland Speaks again with Alex Salmond.
Hi.
Now, Robin McAlpine, one of your criticisms of the current approach to independence is you think the SNP government and other independence supporters have got themselves bogged down in process without thinking of the objective and the ideal and the conversion that's required. But isn't that just because they're not very good at process? Is that not why they're bogged down in it?
Well, yes, but we are trying to skip to the end. That's the problem. We're trying to skip to the bit where we force the ability of everybody to see that we have a settled will. So that's the purpose of a referendum. The purpose of a referendum is to force everybody to see that we have the settled will of Scotland for an outcome of independence. And the problem is we don't yet have the settled will. And the thing that you do to get and win a referendum is different than what you do for the steady building of support among people who are not quite there yet. And I know a lot of people have argued that you can only change minds during a referendum. Therefore, to change the minds, we have to have the referendum. But that's not true. There are other ways to do it, and we've not tried enough of them.
But wouldn't the experience suggest exactly that? I mean, by and large, if you interpret real polls for independence, independence knocked around the 30% mark for a long time in Scottish politics. It was only when battle was joined and the issue was put to the touch and people were confronted with a decision that the campaign accelerated in all its glory in the summer of 2014, and that 30% became 45%, perhaps more at some points.
Yep, that's absolutely right. And what the learning from this is, there's an academic who's looking across the Basque Country, the Catalans, and Scotland to try and learn these lessons. What is it that's causing these upturns? And the outcome, the thing that we've discovered is that it's a political or cultural event gives people a permission to reconsider their position. However, a referendum is only one of those. In fact, it's in the minority. So, as you will yourself remember, another one was the discovery of North Sea oil. It was a political event that caused a change in the atmosphere. The Basque peace process did exactly the same thing, and there was a big cultural event in the late 90s, early 2000s in Catalonia that did the same thing. So again, that's cart before horse. If the question is, from where we are now, how do we get enough support? If there was a fast route to a referendum, maybe that would be a good idea. But since we don't have one, let's do something we can actually do, which is start treating no voters with a bit more respect and answer their questions, engage with them, and let's try and bring them towards independence. We haven't been doing that systematically, and that's a mistake.
So last weekend you published a new strategy for independence. Summarise what you were trying to say in that document and how people can see in its full glory where it's going to be available to them.
Well, if you haven't seen it already by social media or in the press, you can certainly go to the Commonweal website, commonweal.scot, and you can download it from there. There's different versions, so there's a long one, a shorter one, and a very short summary. Right, so what I'm really trying to do is pull us back and say, right, let's start conceptually to see, how do we actually win independence? Because I think we're kind of forgetting this a little bit. So the first thing that I want to say is we've got lost in this idea that a referendum is a gold standard. This is nonsense. This is not true. The gold standard of becoming an independent country is a recognition agreement with the nation from which you are ceding. So as long as the country from which you are leaving is very happy for you to go, the rest of the international community is going to shrug and say, well, fair enough, that's okay with us. If it's okay with them, it's okay with us. So the recognition agreement for a country like Scotland is the crucial thing. And a referendum is a means of getting to the negotiations for a recognition agreement. But there are other modes. So what I'm saying is, let's remember that first. What we are trying to do is drag the UK government to the negotiating table to negotiate a settlement for Scotland leaving the UK. If we do that, what is it that drags them to the negotiating table? And if someone has found a way to do that without demonstrating the settled will of the people of Scotland to them, I've not seen it. So we have got to get to a point where we can credibly say we have a settled will to pull them to the negotiating table, which means we need to build that public will. And the rest of the paper goes into some depths about how you do that. And then the thing that I've been emphasizing as hard as I possibly can is the bit where you trigger the theatre of demonstrating that you have the public settled will, which could be a referendum, it could be a de facto referendum, it could be a number of other things, right? That's at the end. That's what you do once you've got the upper hand. If you try and do that when you don't have the upper hand, you'll fail, because Westminster can just shrug and say, no, you're not put us in a position where we cannot ignore you. So at the moment, they can ignore us because we're not in a strong enough position. Until we get in a stronger position, they can keep ignoring us. So this is what I'm trying to get across. Remember what we're trying to do. Remember how you really do it. Remember, look at what's happened over the last decade. Learn the lessons of what doesn't work, and let's try the thing we've not done, which is solidly building support by taking voters seriously.
But wouldn't this be interpreted by some, at least in the SNP leadership, as a vindication of the let's sit back and wait for 60% in the polls strategy, which we used to hear aired a few years ago? I mean, what's to stop people saying, well, if we ever get to that critical mass, then of course we'll go ahead, but we'll have to wait till that critical mass? I mean, aren't you suggesting something that could be abused as a do nothing and wait forever strategy?
Well, that's another part of what I've been trying to do, because that's exactly what happened. People may not remember this, but the 60% quote was me. I said it on the 19th of September in 2014. The day after the Indy Ref, I said, right, that was a great democratic showing on our part. We've made enormous progress. To break through, we need to have dominance in the polls. It's the only thing that will break this now, is dominance in the polls. And what happened was, to my great horror, that was supposed to be a reason why on the 19th of September we should get off our arses and start building again immediately, to build a campaign to shift us to a position where we had that electoral dominance. And to my horror, briefly afterwards, it became a bizarre reason for why we shouldn't act. Now, that is one of the things which was playing in my mind very much when I was producing this.
It's all your fault then, Robin McAlpine. It's entirely your fault.
It's my fault for providing the correct answer and then that correct answer being skewed around, because we cannot do this without the settled will. So we've got to recognise that we do not have the way otherwise. So one of the things that I've done in advance of this coming out is trying to get across to people, please, this is genuinely my best guess at how we do this. It is possible to take elements out of this, out of their context, and produce a plan which benefits one group or another group or this party or that party. And if we do that, we betray the cause of independence. So it's impossible to put ideas into public domain without the possibility that these will be distorted. I dwelt long and hard about whether this is the right time to put this out, because I've been thinking about it for a long period of time. And my conclusion is that people are so down just now, and there's such a sense that we don't have a route forward, that it was worth putting it out there. But I am worried that what we get is cherry picking and ways of avoiding taking action. And this is my whole argument. My whole argument is that we've got to stop waiting for something that might happen in 12 months or 18 months. We've got to start talking about something that we can do tomorrow. And these are things that we can do tomorrow.
Finally, Rob McAlpine, is there not another counter-argument that the stronger the will seems to be, the more settled it seems to be in Scotland, the more that Westminster will resist and prevaricate? I mean, they've had some practice at this with subject colonial peoples around the world. They're not unpracticed at the art of prevarication and delay, are they?
No, they're absolutely not. But Alex, you know this better than most. What do? Get weaker? Go in with a weaker hand? The stronger your hand gets, the more that they will play their hand aggressively. Of course. And how do you deal with that? You get a stronger hand. So it's as simple as that. Let's not be naive here. They will ignore us forever if we're kicking about at 47%, because they can. And this is a thing when I'm training people to do political strategy. This is something that I do very early on, which is I say, role play being your opponent. Be the other side. Sit down and think. You're the other side. This is a given set of circumstances. What would you do? And I'm telling you, if the independence movement came to me at 47% or even 51%, I'd be laughing my socks off and I'd say, let's just go for a cup of tea and keep ignoring them, because we can. And you know that that's true. We have to have a stronger hand in negotiation with what is a stronger opponent. They have more power. We don't get a stronger hand. We can't negotiate. We can't negotiate. We can't become independents. This is top and bottom, the simple reality of where we are in 2023. If we don't get ourselves a stronger hand from where we are, we'll still be talking about this in 10 years' time.
Robin McAlpine, author of A New Strategy on Independence, thank you so much for joining me on Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.
Welcome back, and back to the theme of this week's show on routes to Scottish independence. Now, just 1 year ago, the SNP were proclaiming that we would have our independence referendum on the 19th of October this year. No ifs, no buts. But this year, even at their party conference, the leadership resolutions are open to some interpretation. Two MPs who have been very busy examining varying routes to independence have been Douglas Chapman and Angus Brendan MacNeil. They find themselves in two very different positions at the moment, one inside the SNP and one who's been expelled. Alex is in conversation with them both.
Now, I'm delighted to be joined by two well-travelled participants of the road to independence, Douglas Chapman MP and Angus Brendan MacNeil, the Member of Parliament for Naheela and Yea. Now, Douglas Chapman first, can you help us with the interpretation of these independence strategy motions going to the SNP conference? The one from the leadership, that's from Hamza Yousaf and from Stephen Flynn, your Westminster leader, it says that if the SNP win most seats at the next general election, then they should begin immediate negotiations to have to bring democratic effect for Scotland. I mean, does that mean in shorthand, if the SNP win most seats, they ask for a referendum? Is that what it means?
Well, they could be interpreted like that. There's no doubt about it. But what I would say is, you know as well as I do that any motion that comes before conference will be up to members to decide on the best way forward. And I know that there's a series of amendments that will come to that motion as well. So, until we see what other amendments are available and other options are available, then it's hard to actually sort of make a definitive statement about that. I know I've signed a motion that's been promoted by one of the Perthshire branches, and I think for me at least, then that ticks the boxes in terms of where we need to take the independence campaign in the future, which is to if we win a majority of the vote, and that would include support for other parties that are pro-independence, for example, your own party, ALBA, and the Greens, for example. So if we can gain and garner sufficient support that takes us to 50% plus one, then that then opens the door to negotiations with the UK government. And if we get back to the situation where they say, well, now is not the time or something equivalent to that, then we've got a mechanism within that motion that holds their feet to the fire. So within 90 days of them not deciding to cooperate and talk to us, then that would be a trigger to withdraw our MPs from Westminster. And we then move into totally different territory beyond that, because it would be setting up a independent assembly or something similar in Scotland, so that we could discuss our way forward from there.
So Angus Brendan MacNeil, that's the let's call it the rebel amendment or motion being put forward by Douglas Chapman and his colleagues to the SNP conference. So that sounds very like the sort of stuff you've been arguing for over a number of years. So Angus MacNeil, why aren't you then in there with Douglas Chapman arguing for that amendment to see what the delegates think, as opposed to being stuck in your bara fastness?
Well, I suppose timing and events, but I have seen the Perthshire motion and it makes an awful lot more sense than the leadership motion. I don't think we'll call Douglas a rebel on this. We'll maybe call Douglas a leader on this, and the Perthshire people who are leading more sensibly, because I think the leadership motion, and hopefully they aren't too far gone in their own thinking that they can't take good advice from other people. I mean, the problem of having a de facto referendum in an election and then going by seats. Well, if it's a de facto referendum, you have to go by votes, because it's instead of a referendum. You don't have seats in a referendum. And otherwise, you would call referendums de facto elections and do it. You could win it in a minority. You might have won in 45%, for instance, in 2014, if it was a de facto election you'd held, Alec. But the point is, you have to do this on seats. And the other point is, if you do, on votes, if you do it on seats and you have fewer seats, that's a problem presentationally. You could have 40% of the vote and say 10 less seats, and then you think you've got the right to go forward to independence. You wouldn't have it. Wouldn't stand. What will stand and what the Perthshire vote motion has got is if you have the majority of votes. And incidentally, I don't think there'll be much problem with anybody afterwards if the majority of votes goes for independence, because if people show they want independence, it'll be respected, not just in Westminster, but from Reykjavik to Wellington, probably it will be respected all across the world. And I think that we'll find ourselves in quite a good position then. And a pan-nationalist alliance or a pan-independence alliance of some sort is what's required. Incidentally, I've written a letter to ALBA, which you will see at some point, I'm sure, and to the SNP, saying that I'm standing here in the Hebrides and we should all work together, and possibly with the Greens as well. We can go back to normal politics when Scotland becomes a normal country. So,
Douglas Chapman, there's Angus MacNeil, a one-man Scotland United coalition in the Western Isles. Do you think that the SNP should be backing him on a policy something like let's call it the Perthshire motion for a majority of votes in independence negotiations?
Well, as you pointed out earlier, Angus Brendan doesn't have a say at the SNP conference anymore, and that's a separate kind of argument that we could have on a different show. But I think Angus makes a really good point about the working together, because that's something that I think we should be trying to do more of, and do it in a real serious, concerted manner, where as long as people all come to the table in a respectful manner, then that's something we really need to do. The unionists don't have to try too hard to drive wedges between different parts of the independence movement at the moment. And what we should be doing is trying to make their job much more difficult and holding their feet to the fire in every way we can. And to do that, we need to put down the claymores and everything else our mobile phones with Twitter and Facebook and all the rest of it, where a lot of nonsense is dribbled out every day, and actually get round the table and have some serious talks about how do we take this country forward, the country we all love. How do we take that forward to make sure that we stand the best possible chance of making Scotland an independent nation? And we can do it. We can do it. I think between the three of us, we've all got scars on our back over the years. That various things have happened, and there's things I'm not happy about that have happened in recent months. But we've got to be bigger than that, and we've got to put something, these personal grievances, animosities, whatever you want to call them, to one side, because the challenge we've got is bigger than anything that we feel as individuals. And
yeah, I mean, I think what Douglas is saying there is absolutely right. We approach this election in a new way, rather than making this a party-focused election. The ideal for me was always going to be a standalone Holyrood election on independence, and then that isn't going to happen, at least before the Westminster election. So the Westminster election is going to be the first opportunity, and if we approach the election in a different way and make this about the issue of independence, I think the people of Scotland will react to it in a positive light. We'd be lost in the media anyway if we don't. If we just make it a normal party election, we'll get lost by whatever the ultra low emission zones in London or whatever. But if we are making it about independence, not only will the Scottish people be aware of that, but we're aware of it outside Scotland. And if we do happen to get the majority of the votes together, then that is a good springboard for going forward. And one, I think, incidentally, that Westminster would respect, and certainly be respected across the world, and that's probably our most important thing. Firstly, the Scottish people will recognise it, Westminster will recognise it, and across the world will recognise it, and all those three things working together. But we have to make it different. If we go and say, vote for my party, but if you want independence by voting for another party, it doesn't count. That just tells the people straight away you're not serious about independence, and it is a normal election for you. And when we've done normal elections in the past, we've had normal results and not yielded very much in the last decade. So it's time to change that.
Douglas Chapman, there's a lot of discussion, understandably, on the question of process, and how is the process by which you assert independence democratically. But surely the bigger discussions are on how you enforce that process. Surely the biggest discussion is, given the track record of Westminster, how do you get them to the table? How do you get them to negotiate? How do you force them into an acceptance of the democratic position? Now, Angus MacNeil says, well, they will if it's more than 50% of the vote. Other people wouldn't be too sure. What's your opinion on that? And what is the enforcement mechanism of making the Westminster Parliament accept the democratic verdict of the Scottish people?
Well, I think if we had the answer to that one, we'd already be independent, because it's over the last 8 years we've just seen, we've had the ball at the end of our tennis racket, if you like, and every time we've put the ball over the net, it's just been batted back. So how do we actually try and overcome that? And I think one of the things we need to think about is that unity of purpose. And I think we need a Scotland that is fully behind the independence vote. So if we get a majority, 50% plus one, that gives us that option. But the motion I'm speaking to at conference will also be saying we need to hold the UK feet to the fire. They've had a really easy time in terms of their constitutional argument over the last few years, and we must make it much more difficult for them to wriggle out that particular set of circumstances. So I think the withdrawal of our MPs will send a very, very strong message internationally, never mind within the UK. People will say, well, why is Scotland doing that? Why would they withdraw from Westminster? And I think the real issue there is that you make a stance on what you're prepared to accept and what you're prepared not to accept. And the status quo, doing as we did over the last few years, where we've had everybody in the SNP knows, and everybody in the Yes movement knows, we've had mandate after mandate without any real change or any change in effect of that mandate being given to the government of the day here in Scotland, or to our group of MPs at Westminster. So how
Angus MacNeil, aren't you a bit blasé? The points that Douglas Chapman is making there are very strong ones. You've always been a bit blasé about this, saying, well, if we get an overall majority of votes, then Westminster will accept it like any democratic countries should. What evidence do you have for this acceptance of democracy in perfidious Albion?
Well, I think, firstly, you go to paragraph 81 of the Supreme Court, which shows the ballot box carries authority, and the reason they didn't enable or allow a referendum coming out of the Scottish Parliament was because if it went a certain way, it would mean a certain thing. And I think what I would disagree with Douglas is, given that the ballot box carries authority, we actually haven't had any ballot box giving us 50% yet. Now, we've got to work to get 50% in the ballot box. It's okay to say we've got a manifesto and we won the Scottish election in whatever terms, and now this is what our manifesto says, and it's up to some other party to complete our manifesto. Other political parties do not fulfill your manifesto. If you don't get over the line of majority, you ain't going to get there. And if we're in a Westminster election, we can't get that on seats alone. And if we're in a Scottish Parliament election, we don't have the authority in that Parliament, as the Supreme Court said, to agree a referendum. So therefore, we have to go straight to it on de facto referendum and get that 50%. And I don't think, speaking off the record to many politicians at Westminster, none of them want to be a Lukashenko or a Putin or deny democracy. And then the second point, where I don't think I'm blasé, but I'm happy to be challenged about it, I spoke to the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak at the liaison committee, where I put these points to him, and he studiously avoided saying that he would be a democracy denier. And I don't think Westminster wants to be in that situation where there's a lot going on in the world, where there are democracy deniers, Putin and Lukashenko most notably. They don't want to be in the company of those people. And ultimately, we shouldn't make bogeymen of Westminster when they aren't given us evidence to be bogeymen. We shouldn't presuppose they will be bogeymen and will be nasty when there is just no evidence for that at all. We should expect the best of behavior from them to recognize democracy and let them live up to that. If, of course, they don't, I do think there's a lot to be said in what Douglas on the Perthshire motion is saying in the 90 days. We've got to create another event. But frankly, I don't think it'll get to that. But we have to be ready to create events. The last few years have been marked by doing nothing other than it's no fair and they're not doing what we asked them. And we really didn't have much to whip them with, if you like.
Now, one last short, sharp and impertinent question to you both. Douglas Chapman, what are your plans for October the 19th, the date of the so-called no ifs, no buts referendum?
Well, I was thinking of being in Barra and launching my campaign against Angus Brendan. Maybe I should stand as an independent and rummel them up a bit in the Western Isles and take the Persia motion to the doors of the good people of Barra. Maybe that's what should happen. But it's I think that in a way it's a great disappointment that 19th October will not be a referendum date. But we have the opportunity, I think maybe an even better opportunity within a general election scenario where we can get to 50% plus one and make that our referendum. If they're not going to play ball, then we need to have the balls, if I may use that phrase, to actually take them on head on. And for decisions that they make in London, I'm afraid they need to realise as well that there are consequences for their behaviour. And the consequences will be that, if the Persia motion does succeed, then their feet will be held to the fire.
Well, lastly and briefly, Angus MacNeil, it's going to be crowded in Barra on October the 19th. Are you going to raise one of your famous flags over the sands?
Yes, I think so. I mean, when I heard no ifs, no buts, I thought, but how? And it's a good example of when somebody proclaims something to kick the can down the road. Eventually, they were going to run out of road, and it was very clear. I think that was the last stage in the road where you couldn't say no ifs, no buts, when you didn't actually have the full powers to make it happen. And you're going to the Supreme Court, and you had no plan before the Supreme Court. You're clueless, as I said, after the Supreme Court. And I think what the 19th of October should be a reminder to us all of is the cluelessness of what has happened in the past. And let's make sure there's a better clue going forward. And that best clue going forward is working together. So we create a proper event at the next Westminster election that's going to be about independence, that the people can take seriously, that the media can take seriously, and that the world can take seriously. And that should be the no ifs, no buts event.
Angus Brendan MacNeil, Douglas Chapman, two of the good guys of independence politics. Thank you so much for joining me on Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.
Welcome.
Welcome back. In our last two shows, we took a break from politics and economics and turned to the world of art, sports and culture. Of course, we followed super gran and super fan Maura Brown on her trip to Larnaca to support Scotland's national team. And last week, we were with Gerard Burns at his home in Dullator, which houses his amazing studios. Let's take a look at some excerpts from those two shows. As you can see, I'm surrounded by Scotland football fans who are just about to enter the stadium. just about to enter the stadium to watch the game, and we're hoping for a good result. Now, this show is dedicated to one of Scotland's greatest super fans called Moira Brown, and we're going to explore her journey all the way here to Larnaca to watch the game. And her journey started at Hampden with Alex Salmond.
Turning to the current Scottish side, who hopefully are going to take you back to Germany next year, but the current Scottish side, have you got a wee favourite among the players?
Yeah, got one or two, but one that inspires me because he inspires others on the park, with his fighting qualities is John McGinn.
John McGinn. I'm really glad you said that, Moira, for reasons that will become apparent.
Pleasure to meet you and keep on inspiring the way you do.
Oh, thank you.
See that number, Moira?
90, yeah.
Yeah, you watched my spelling. I know you were a head teacher, so you watched my spelling. Legend. Right, I'm writing legend.
Another friend of the show, the late Doddy Weir, is one of your most remarkable subjects. I mean, the painting of Doddy is just, well, it's just Doddy, that's Absolutely. What it is. What was it like painting such a legendary figure?
So that came about a slightly circuitous route. I'd agreed to paint Doddy as part of a fundraising exercise. They did a big event over in Hong Kong. And I think Doddy's portrait is a good example of what a portrait actually is. Had I painted Doddy 5 years previously, it would have been a completely different painting. And when I went to meet Doddy, I think he was a wee bit nervous. We went out to try and take some photos. He decided he was going to put on the suit. And Doddy, what I learned about Doddy is that to make people feel at ease, he would act the clown. That was what he did. And I had all these goofy shots, these kind of a big daft shapes and his leg up and all that. And eventually I had to say, Doddy, I think this is completely wrong. You're in a really difficult place right now. This has to be quite a serious painting. It needs to have some pathos. And actually the day that we were taking the photographs, it was freezing cold. We were getting to the end of it. And I said, I want you to put your hands in your pockets and stare straight to camera. And he couldn't get his hands in his pockets. Cathy had to come and put his hands in his pockets, so the shine was off it completely. And that last series of images I got of him straight to camera, and you can see the pain across his eyes. Those were the ones without question. And I imposed the background on it. I wanted it to be of the borders. So it's the Eildon Hills which are in the background. So there's one last, I think, beautiful story. I imposed rain clouds, I imposed dark clouds across the back of the portrait because I wanted to say that there's trouble and there are some streaks, black cloud streaks. And Doddy asked me at the portrait gallery, you've never told me what the 4 bands of light are at the back of the painting. I'm saying, which bands of light? The 4 bands of light. I said, Doddy, that's rain clouds. He didn't see the rain clouds. He saw the bands of light, I think, as a metaphor for the way that the guy tackled his illness. I just think that's absolutely beautiful.
What a great story, and what a memorable one too.
And now to my favourite part of the show and your reaction to those shows. Ross Hamilton says, this is brilliant. Listening to Moira can't help but put a smile on my face. What a lovely woman, and John McGinn was great with her. Good show as always, thanks to all involved. Azulin Ho says, Moira would get an honorary Granny Award for me, Mon Scotland.
Trish says, celebration of Scottish culture, historical and contemporary. Beautiful. Scotland the Brave says, a touch of class from Alex Salmond. You see a lot of Gerard Burns portraits. He's loved by all the celebrities, but they all want paintings of themselves. Salmond had the round in his office. He's always thinking of other people, the country and independence. If only our leaders today were more like you, we'd be free. Charlie says, beautiful show in so many ways. Art says it all, and the truth is art. We believe in Scotland. Thanks for an amazing show. Keep them coming. Scotland the Brave comes back again and says, the Doddy Weir one is fantastic. His spirit will be roaming free in the borders. A great man. And finally, Frank says, the Glasgow boys are still active and personified in the work of this lad. May his palate be ever busy.
Thank you very much indeed for your messages, and please do keep them coming in. We love to read them and indeed read them out. Now over to Alex as he starts a brand new series of Scotland's Hidden Heroes.
I'm very pleased to introduce a brand new edition of our set of Scotland's Hidden Heroes, this time sponsored by Flagship Media. Because when I was a lad way back in Livgay, I remember sitting astonished in front of the television set back in the 1970s when a Scottish historian called Dr. Ian Grimble appeared on the scene. And what Ian Grimble did, without an autocue and just straight to camera, just like this, was to unveil the life of someone called Thomas Cochrane, the 10th Earl of Dundonald. And as I watched it, I thought to myself, why haven't I heard of this guy? It's the most amazing story, an extraordinary life. A naval captain, a radical politician, a scourge of the establishment, and somebody who throughout his long life was constantly battling with his superiors, but emerged eventually vindicated, having won extraordinary victories in the Napoleonic Wars, made an impact in Parliament as a radical MP, and then liberated most of South America. Because that's exactly what Thomas Cochrane did. He was thrawn. He was difficult. He was a man that people found it easy to hate and difficult to admire. But the general public, of course, loved him. Loved him so much that 1 year, less than a year in fact, after being indicted and convicted of a stock market swindle, he was triumphantly elected, or I think unopposed, to the seat of Westminster. Such was his popularity. Looking back on that swindle, was it trumped up by his opponents, by the establishment, by the government? Was he the unsuspecting and unwitting victim of an establishment plot? Probably. There was circumstantial evidence against him, but later it was indicated that circumstantial evidence should not have led to a conviction. But Cochrane himself, after a triumphant career through the Napoleonic Wars, a substantial impact as a radical MP, found himself disgraced from society. His coat of arms, his heraldic coat of arms, was dragged from Westminster Abbey in total disgrace. It was a service of degradation, as it's called. But Cochrane wasn't finished, not by any means. He decided to accept an invitation to go off to South America, where successfully he liberated Chile, Peru almost incidentally from the Spanish, and then Brazil from the Portuguese, in a series of naval engagements, the like of which has never been seen in history, where a small flotilla of liberation ships defeated the full might of the Spanish and Portuguese armadas which were assembled against them. To this day, there is a frigate, suitably a Type 26 built in the Clyde, called the Admiral Cochrane in the Chilean Navy. And he's still recognised in Brazil as one of the essential figures in the liberation of that country. And so looking back to these days of my boyhood, when I heard about the Admiral Cochrane, the sea wolf, as Napoleon once dubbed him, I thought to myself, why haven't we heard of this guy? And that's the inspiration for this series of Scotland's Hidden Heroes. Admiral Cochrane, Thomas Cochrane, Earl of Dundonald, victorious and brave sea captain, fearless radical MP, scourge of the establishment, liberator of South America, and eventually restored to full titles on the personal intervention of Queen Victoria herself. What could be a better start of our latest edition of Scotland Hidden Heroes than to celebrate the life of Thomas Cochrane, one of Scotland's true heroes.
Welcome back to Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond, and indeed back to the theme of this week's show on routes to Scottish independence. Now, one person has a very unique perspective on the route to independence because he was a senior civil servant in the Scottish Government in the run-up to the 2014 independence referendum. He is now a political activist and member of the National Executive of the ALBA party. Alex speaks with Daniel Jack.
And now I'm delighted to be joined by someone who can provide a unique context for the strategy for independence, someone who was a senior civil servant during the last referendum campaign and is now a political activist of the National Executive of the ALBA party. Daniel Jack, I think you're somewhere north of Helsinki. Now you join us on Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.
Yes, that's right, Alex. Thank you so much for inviting me. Just about 25 kilometres north of Helsinki in a commuter town called Tuusula.
Now, you were a senior civil servant representing Scotland in the United States and being part of the senior civil service in Scotland. So that context of the independence campaign then, if you contrast that with now, the political context, what are the main differences that you see?
I think, as you said, I was in the last campaign, I was an outsider in a sense because I was thousands of miles away representing your government in Washington. And so for me, the big difference, I think, is the level of engagement that there was then compared to now. I remember after the referendum, I was invited to give a speech at the University of Maine about how the referendum had unfolded. And the academics there were particularly interested in the incredible turnout, but also the enthusiasm was demonstrated during the referendum. And in my speech, I spoke about how the whole concept had galvanized society across Scotland. You know, there were the comedians for independence, writers for independence, artists for independence, across the length and breadth of Scotland, using community halls and that sort of thing. And this was a completely alien concept to those academics. They'd never come across that before, especially not in American politics, where, as you know, everything is limited. Engagement is limited merely to town hall meetings and that sort of thing.
So how do we recapture? Some people, of course, Daniel, thought I was part of Comedians for Independence, but how do we recapture in the independence campaign that great a surge of enthusiasm in the run-up to the 2014 referendum?
Well, I think we need to go back to first steps and what you did previously in the referendum, and that was to create a narrative and set out a route map for the restoration of Scotland's independence. And following on from that, you need to create a mechanism for engaging people with that concept. And that's the element that I think is missing at the moment. Or it's certainly there, but it's not there in the degree and the intensity that it was previously. And I think that's what we need to energize. Now, in terms of the ALBA party, of which you said I'm a member of the NEC, I think for us, it's about motivating our members. Because in the period we're about to embark on, you know, the build up to general election and then hot on the heels of that, Holyrood 2026, we need every member to be engaged. You know, they're the foot soldiers in this fight. We need excellent candidates, obviously, but everybody needs to feel that sense of ownership. And I think at the moment, there isn't that wider sense of ownership across the party and indeed across the independence movement. So there needs to be that stirring of emotions, if you like, and that sense that, well, we're all in this together and we need to do our part, play our part to make this a reality.
Now, you're an international Scot. Do you get a sense that sometimes we get blasé in Scotland to the amount of serious talent across the range of human endeavour, which there actually is within the national movement?
Oh, I think that's undoubtedly true. I mean, from my observation of other countries where I visited and stayed, you sit back, you look at the political structures, you look at government structures, and you sit back and you think, well, there is nothing happening here which couldn't happen in Scotland, in an independent Scotland. And I think we're incredibly enriched by the people we have involved in the independence movement and in ALBA party in particular. We need to harness that. We need to engage with people and harness their skills, their enthusiasm, their motivation. Because I really do believe that with the best will in the world, we will not succeed without that groundswell of support that we require.
Now, of course, we could take it as a good sign that you're on your way back to Scotland. Should we read into this that you're expecting things to happen soon, Daniel?
Well, I don't know is the answer to that, but I'm excited about coming back, having been in Finland for 5 years. Having been overseas during the last independence referendum, I want to be in the thick of things. I want to be seen to be supporting you, obviously, in the ALBA party. I want to do my bit. And I'm quite excited about the fact of returning to Scotland at this crucial time.
And if you're just in a phrase or two to encapsulate with your experience internationally, what the national movement, and particularly the Scottish Government, have to convey in order to convince people internally, externally, that they're serious about independence, what would that be?
Well, I think there's two elements to that. Internally, you need to demonstrate that the seriousness of the intent of your political agenda. And I really think that has been missing within Scotland in recent years. But internationally, I think we need to demonstrate that we have a coherent narrative, and we have a plan for coherent international engagement. It's no use putting all our energies and efforts into securing independence and then turning to the international community and saying, oh, by the way, we've arrived on the scene. We need to lay the groundwork now. And that is about engaging with the right people at the right time, both individuals, both political parties, governments, and international organizations.
Are you saying that isn't being done at the present moment from your experience?
No, I don't. I absolutely don't think that's been done. But in fairness to the Scottish Government, I would say that there are all sorts of blocks being put in their way by the Foreign Office and others to make sure that that doesn't happen. We had the recent letter from James Cleverly, which was about chaperoning Scottish Government diplomats when they meet other governments.
But then you're only chaperoned if you allow yourself to be chaperoned. I mean, do you think that Madame de Coste, the late great Winnie Ewing, what would have been her response to being told she was going to be chaperoned by somebody from the Foreign Office?
Oh yes, you're absolutely right, Alex. There are ways to circumvent these restrictions, and indeed, that's what I did in Washington. I cultivated my own contacts within the State Department. I met one-on-one with officials from the State Department and other areas of government in the US, out with the knowledge of the UK government. Now, maybe my interlocutors in the US government reported back to the UK government, but I certainly did it. And that proved quite beneficial in terms of in the build-up to the referendum.
So, from your experience, I mean, are there around the world, and I'm thinking the way we mobilise expat Scots, international Scots in the business world in terms of inward investment or trading relations, do you think that there's the same resource internationally to get friends at court, as it were, who are kicking on Scotland's side in positions of influence?
Yes, undoubtedly. And I mean, to give you an example, here in Finland, there's an MP from somewhere north in Lapland who regularly tweets and comments about Scottish independence. So there are people, if we are able to identify them, in different locations who could provide this groundswell of support within political structures overseas to help our cause.
Daniel Jacques, we're looking forward enormously to your return to Scotland. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining me in Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.
Thank you so much, Alex.
Now, when I left the leadership of the Scottish National Party in 2014, I thought the game was up. Not the game up for Scottish independence, I thought the game was up for the British state. Because the pendulum had moved to such an extent in terms of support for Scottish freedom and Scottish nationhood, I didn't see any way the British state could survive that democratic surge over the next few years. It was difficult to say when the circumstances would arise, but you could be confident of the destination. And now looking back over these last 9 years, I think to myself, how wrong can you be? I still don't fully understand, indeed I don't understand at all why the opportunity of Brexit, not the Brexit opportunity that the mad Brexiteers talk about, but the opportunity politically that Brexit presented for Scottish independence, instead of being used to drive home and complete the independence message, it was used in some formulation to try and undo the democratic decision of the people of England. I've got no idea why that was the case. But it has been the case, and perhaps it typifies what's really wrong with the independence movement at the present moment. And that is lack of seriousness of intent. And that infects the situation in a range of ways. It doesn't mean that everybody in the independence movement wouldn't like to see independence as quickly as possible. Clearly, many of us would. But there is little faith in the seriousness of an intent of the Scottish Government. And of course, Westminster has obviously picked that up. They've got every confidence that they could see off the present degree of resolution of the Scottish Government forever and a day, for centuries, the way things are going. And why shouldn't they? They've got every reason to be complacent about direction. The SNP conference is a case in point. We've got the leadership of the SNP in the Scottish Government and at Westminster playing with words, pretending one thing to the national movement, that this new resolution is a statement of the intention on independence, while simultaneously briefing the press that actually all it is, if we win a majority of seats, we'll try for another referendum. In other words, do exactly what they've been doing over the last 9 years, the Einstein definition of madness, repeating the same thing with the expectation of a different result. Although in some ways it's encouraging to see new thinking coming forward. The paper by Robin McAlpine, a case in point. Of course, as he admits himself, there is a danger that once again his views will be cherry-picked as an excuse, a pretext for delay, but nonetheless there's a lot of serious thinking in it. The reassessment of members of Parliament, such as Douglas Chapman and Angus MacNeil, but Angus MacNeil expunged from the SNP, Douglas Chapman no longer going to be an SNP MP after the next election, but nonetheless their thinking is clarified into what you've got to do in terms of producing a democratic test to take the independence movement forward. And perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised that the ball has been mishandled over the last 9 years, that Scotland hasn't been previously in the situation of half the population wanting independence and a Scottish Government and a Scottish Parliament, and that support enduring despite the uncertainty of the leadership in the issue. Perhaps we should actually be thinking, well, if we can still have support for independence at that level, after the lack of resolution, the lack of direction, the lack of clarity, the lack of seriousness of intent, then that should be a comfort to us all. Because as soon as we arrange the political furniture in such a way as to deliver these things, then we'll find an audience ready and waiting to hear a message conveyed by the supporters of independence in a way that people can rally behind. Except for one thing, of course. And here Robin McAlpine is absolutely correct. You'll never win independence by hectoring the rest of the people of Scotland. You'll not win it either by spending your entire time in vehement attacks on the other parts of the national movement. You can only win independence by delivering a unity of purpose in the national movement, which means that all of the aspects of it have got to be respected and the contribution that they can make has got to be respected, and then conveying that unity of purpose to Scotland as a whole. In that way, the national movement, pursuing the cause of national freedom, can get back and be held in the high esteem which is normally held by the Scottish people. But even more importantly, the confidence it has in our objective will be translated to the population as a whole, and then we'll find that critical mass which supports the action that has to be taken to make Westminster recognise the democratic will and intent of the Scottish people. And now back to Tasmina, who I must say has been loath to tell us that today is her birthday. So I'm handing you back to the birthday girl to close out the programme.
And with that, we come to the end of this week's show. We do hope you've enjoyed watching it. It has been, of course, on my favourite subject and Alex's favourite subject of Scottish independence. Please do keep writing to us with your ideas for shows, of which we've got many from you. Thank you so much. And of course, send us your tweets, emails and messages as per usual. And remember to watch us every week on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify and Apple Podcasts at 9 p.m. And of course, remember to subscribe to the show for additional content. With that, for now, from myself and Alex and all of the team at Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond, we hope to see you all again next week.
This is an exciting time in Scotland's story, and understanding our past will help us determine our future. And when Scotland's voice is heard, it charts the way forward. This is Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.